Hello everyone, this is Mickey from WorldCrest. In this video, I'm going to explore a few options to sew the tab front. This functional detail is also called the partial button placket or half placket because only the top part of the front can be opened up with buttons. A classic example of this is the polo shirt, but you can also see it everywhere else, from blouses to hoodies and everything else. There are multiple ways to achieve this look, and it usually depends on a number of factors. For example, the shape of the bottom of the placket, how the top is attached to a collar or a facing, or just if you're using a twirl tape or a strip of fabric to finish it. In this video, we're going to focus on the classic way to make this partial placket with additional strips of fabric. We'll start breaking it down from how the pattern should look like, and then using some of my fabric scraps, I'll go through a few variations to construct the tab. Yeah, I don't want this video to be just how to sew this particular tab front variation, but I want to get you thinking about how a half placket actually works. So you can either add one to your own project, adapt and hack it when your pattern calls for something else, and of course, if your sewing pattern is just really confusing because it kind of skips steps or illustrates really badly, you'll know how to sew it yourself by the end of this video. Let's start with this finished look and work backwards from here. First, I'm gonna separate the tab area from the garment front. Now the garment front piece has a rectangle cropped out, and the tab area is just that rectangle. We know that each tab has two layers folded up, so we're just gonna double the tab rectangle over the fold line. Now let's add seam allowance. The garment front gets a seam allowance on all sides, including the cropped out edges. If the width of the finished tab happens to equal twice the seam allowance, then the cropping gets so narrow that it's basically just a slit. For the tab piece, is seam allowance is pretty straightforward. Just add it at all four sides. And also don't forget to cut two tab pieces. This is basically it. If you compare the tab length with the bottom of the cropped rectangle or the length of the slit, you'll notice that they differ by two seam allowances. Make sure to check the tab length before you sew them on. One or both tabs can be longer than this to make some decorative top stitching like an X box or something. We'll get to that later, but you just don't want the tab to get shorter than two seam allowances over the slit or the bottom of the cropped rectangle because it's the minimal length to do the construction. Another thing before sewing is interfacing. For each tab piece, we either interface the entire tab or half of it that's away from my body because it's the outer side of the placket that's going to have buttons or buttonholes on it. Okay, now let's see it in action. I'm attaching the purple tabs to this blue front, and I've drawn out the slit and the seam allowance around it. The finished tab will be 3 centimeters or 1 1/8 inches wide, which is pretty typical. To prepare for sewing, draw the slit and the seam allowance box like this. We should interface the tabs. Let's pretend that I just did because this is not for real. While we're still with the iron, fold the tabs in half to press. Step 2, stay stitch the corners of this box or all of this box with a short stitch length. Try to do it precisely on the lines we just drew. Or if you want to add a decorative trim or piping to the finished tab, put it around this box on the right side and stitch along all the sides and pivoting at the corners. Then cut the slit open, then cut toward each corner. Be careful to cut almost to the corner but not into the stitches. Now take a tab piece and line up a raw edge with the tabs right side facing the garment's wrong side. Sew precisely from the stay stitch corner to the top edge, directly on the box lines. Press the tab towards the slit and press in the seam allowance on the other side. Then flip the tab to the right side of the garment, pinning it down. We can let the tab bottom through onto the right side of the garment, but take care not to catch that bottom seam allowance because we'll only stop at the corner of the box. And it now looks like this. Do the same for the other side, so now we have two overlapping tabs. Now bring both bottom ends to the wrong side of the garment. There's a convention for which side goes on top, but personally I like to make it depending on whether the wearer of the garment is left-handed or right-handed. If I flip this up, you can see here from the bottom to top, there is one tab, two tabs, and the little triangle. To seal the bottom of the tab, we sew these three little parts together in a horizontal line. Be precise and careful here because otherwise the bottom can fray or stick out. We don't want that to happen. Finally, finish the raw edge of this little bottom. Popular options are zigzagging, serging, or binding. Then top stitch the end of the garment to flatten it. Personally, I think this method is a bit fiddly because of that little triangle at the bottom and just how the bottom corners get so much stress when I try to put them on. And if you look closely, my tabs are actually a little bit wider than the tab window. This is because the tab's top stitching needs to cover the stay stitching, so I kind of have to squeeze the tab to fit the bottom of the window. And of course, other people have this problem too, so that's why a lot of times the outer tab is a bit longer than the inner tab. So when the longer end is brought to the front or the right side of the garment, it can cover up the bottom of the window. Once the long tab's edge is folded in, we can do some decorative Xbox top stitching over it. As a variation, a quicker way to sew this is to fold the tabs wrong sides together, line both edges of the tab with the window, and sew it to the right side of the garment front. Then we can just flip the tabs and serge over the raw edges, and maybe top stitch that seam allowance to the garment too. Either way, there is a caveat here because the plackets made like this can only be attached to a shirt collar on the top edge, not a facing or a binding. To see why, just think about the order that we attached the plackets to the slit. We sewed the placket on the garment's wrong side first and then flipped it to do the right side. But if we were to use a facing to finish the top edge of the garment, a facing needs to be sewn right sides together with the garment front at the top edge and then flipped to the wrong side. So if the tab is connected to the facing, either with a seam or a cut directly in one piece with the tab has to follow that order too. So with the facing, we first sew the tab to the right side of garment. Sew the facing at the top edge and then flip everything to the wrong side. We'll see this in action in just a bit. Besides the facing, the same scenario and ordering kind of applies if we are finishing the top edge with a woven bias binding. Because a bias binding is just a really narrow piece of facing. And it's the same scenario if the top edge is a single layered collar, like the polo shirt with a knit collar, because we need a knit neckband to finish the knit collar. And so the neckband is constructed the same way as the woven bias binding, which construct the same way as a really narrow facing. So with the knit collar, you actually like sandwich it between the garment front and the band, and everything else is the same. Anyways, my point is that in all these cases, make sure to sew the tab on the right side of the garment and then flip it to the wrong side. I'll stop talking right here because I feel I'm starting to lose you. Instead, let me show you how to sew the half plackets if there's a facing at the top. In this next little experiment, we're going to make the tab corners less fiddly by connecting the two tab pieces into one single pattern piece. Here, I just put two tabs side by side, and in the middle, instead of cutting them into two separate pieces, I made it a slit ending two seam allowances away from the edge. Let's also extend one end of the tab to make it longer so that we can cover the bottom of the window with it. Here are the pieces cut out. On the left is the garment front, and on the right is the plackets. Again, pretend the plackets are already interfaced, and let's get going. Put them right sides together and line up the two slits. Sew this rectangle along all three sides. I try to reduce my stitch length near the corners for better strength. Once again, cut into the slit and then cut as close to the corners as possible. Press in all three edges and turn the tab pieces to the wrong side. Fold and press each tab into shape. If we were sewing the tab piece on the wrong side and turned out to the right side, this long end would have been on the right side of the garment, which is more common. But for this one, we're going to attach a facing, so that's not possible. Here is a narrow and tiny piece of facing or a wide strip of binding, depending on how you see it. Press the facing's bottom edge in, then line it up right sides together with the tab's free edge. Sew them up together and press open. For some garments with a facing, the button placket might already be connected with it and is cut as one single piece, so then feel free to skip. Here is the interesting part. Once the seam allowance is pressed open, we want to fold the two sides of the placket right sides together, so like backwards. In this pattern, the seam between the facing and the placket should overlap with the seam between the placket and the garment. So I'm matching them up right now. And then sew the entire top edge, noticing that the facing and the garment are right side together like they should be. My fabric scraps are pretty small, but on the left side, the garment and the facing should extend all the way to the side seam or whatever design seam the pattern has. So just make sure to sew them all the way. Now trim the corner for the placket and turn the facing over to the wrong side of garment. Flipping it to the wrong side, this should be how the facing and the placket are connected. The only thing left to do is to horizontally stitch down the facing and vertically stitch down the placket. The other tab is longer and is usually on the right side of the garment. In our case here, it unfortunately isn't because we started with the tab and the garment right sides together. If we put the tab on the wrong side of the garment front, it would have been on the right side. For this longer side, we could either fold the tab under and top stitch a box, or let me show you how to make the end pointed. Pinch up the tab right sides together with their allowances folded in. Well, you can see my allowances isn't even on both sides because the sewing isn't 100% accurate, but it's okay. We just need to cover the tab window. We'll sew across this folded tab. Trim the corner and turn out. You can see triangles forming on the wrong side, and on the right side it should be pretty neat. I'll skip the top stitching for this example because the tab isn't on the right side of the garment, but if it was, I would start from this corner where the tab is not top stitched yet. Sew this around in a pentagon shape, and then finally up along the tab. Having done both, I personally like this one piece setup better because it's easier to sew and the result is better for me. It actually turns out a lot of other people agree with me because this one piece technique comes up far more often in home sewing patterns. But still, sometimes you'll find two-piece tabs in your pattern, so just in case you're wondering. All right, here is what we found through our little experiment so far. To sum things up, we talk about how to draft the pattern with two tab pieces, and then steps to sew the tabs, the quick variation for two tabs, and the two directions and orderings to sew them depending on how we finish the top edge, the one piece tab variation, and finally how to sew the pointy bottom. I know this video is getting pretty long, but I hope it saves your time and reduces your struggles. And I'm sure you'll find solutions on your own half-button plackets. Happy sewing!